Hey folks, if we haven't met, my name is Dave. As Johnny said, I'm one of the pastors here at the church. And before we get started, I really feel like I need to tell you guys that I absolutely love Christmas. There was a line in that song that was just played during that video that said, Christmas is my favorite holiday. And I have to say, probably Christmas is my favorite holiday. In fact, I love Christmas because my wife loves Christmas. At our house, we have 2 Christmas trees. Both the same size, both in the same room, because we want to double the joy of Christmas. Our dogs, we have 2 dogs, and they each have a collar with Christmas bells on it, so literally all day, every day, I hear Christmas jingles. And all of my dogs, both of my dogs, have like Christmas advent calendars that they lose their minds over every morning. Now, I feel the need to tell you all of that. I feel the need to start this message out by saying how much I love Christmas, because today I'm going to deconstruct Christmas. See, when I talk to my unchurched family and my unchurched friends about Christmas, and you know, this is a time of the year when all over Australia, all over the world, people are bumping into the Christmas story, right? They drive past houses and they see nativity scenes. People go to the plaza and they see decorations up. We're all bumping into Jesus and especially the Christmas story. But the most challenging thing about the Christmas story is, well, it's the Christmas story. I mean, the Christmas story is so amazing. It's so miraculous. It's so unbelievable. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about Santa and the reindeers, okay? I'm talking about the first Christmas, the birth of Jesus' story. It is so unbelievable that some people just don't believe it. And I kind of understand that. There's a part of me that gets that. And yet, as unbelievable as this Christmas story is, what I want to show you by the end of this message is that there are so many details that we don't know or that we overlook, that I hope that you will see that the Christmas story is even more unbelievable than you've been led to believe. That is my hope for today. But when people talk to me about the Christmas story and they say, hey, I'm not really sure about this whole Christmas story thing, I understand when they ask the question, is it true? Is it true? Is this fantastic, miraculous, amazing Christmas story true? But perhaps a bigger question beyond just is it true, perhaps a better question is it good? Is it good? Is the Christmas story good? Is it good for society? Is it good for humanity? Is the Christmas story good for children? Is it good? Is the Christmas story good for you? Is the Christmas story good for me? And these 2 questions are linked in so many ways, because the reality is when we hear something that's good, when we hear good news, we want it to be true. Like, we want to believe that it's true. And likewise, when we hear bad news, we hope that's not true. For example, we hope that we didn't leave our lights on today. If we hear the news that our lights have been left on in the car park, we hope that that's not true, right? We hope that that's not us that it referred to. When we hear news that's not good, we hope it's not true. That's just human nature. For example, if I was to say to you that apparently Netflix is about to double their monthly subscription rate, all of you would be like, oh, geez, I hope that's not true. It's terrible news. Or if you heard that, I don't know, that it was going to rain all next week, you would again hope that that was not true. But likewise, when we hear something that is good, if we hear good news, it's human nature for us to hope that that's true, right? We hope good news is true. For example, if I was to tell you all that apparently just recently they found that eating fries extends life expectancy, we would all go, that is fantastic news. And I hope that that's true. All of us here, well, not all of us, well, all of us, if we're really honest, we are in church, would hope that this was true. Because it's human nature, it's natural for us, whenever we hear good news, to want it to be true. Now, just because we hope that this is true, just because we hope good news is true, doesn't mean that it's true. but we at least hope that it is. We hope that the good news that we hear is true. But my point is simply that we hear good news, we want it to be true. And here's the thing about this unbelievable, miraculous first Christmas story, this story about the birth of Jesus. We're told when we read the story is that when Jesus was born, when the announcement was made, we are told in Scripture that it was good news. And more than that, it was good news that sparked great joy. And here's the kicker. Here's the thing that maybe is a little bit surprising for some people. It was good news that sparked great joy for all people, not just for some people. It was a story that sparked great joy for all people. Now, if this is true then, if the story of Christmas, the story of that first Christmas is true, and it is good news of great joy for all people, wouldn't we all want it to be true? Wouldn't everybody in every community in every country be leaning in, hoping that the Christmas story was true? But we don't. And I think part of the reason for that, part of the reason why we still struggle with it is because we don't know the story behind the story of Christmas as well as we think we do. We don't know this story as well as we think we know this story. Sure, we know the broad brushes, strokes, we know the details, some of the details, at least from a 50,000-foot view, but we don't know all of the details. And we miss some of them. I think part of the reason we miss some of them is because we've kind of turned the Christmas story into almost like a fairy tale, almost like a bedtime story. It's become something that we've changed enough just to make it palatable for us to believe. And when we do that, we miss how good this Christmas story actually is. And what I want to show you today is that when you have the whole story, this unbelievable story becomes a remarkable story. That's my hope for you today. So just to set the scene, I really believe that whether you come to church every week, if this is your first time or if this is your first time in a long time, you're going to learn something new about the Christmas story today. That's my hope. I want to establish that right from the outset. So let's take a look at that Christmas story. Now, usually when we all think of the Christmas story, we think of the birth of Jesus, we think of the nativity, we probably imagine something that looks a little bit like this. This is the story we all kind of imagine. Now, obviously, this is an artist's interpretation. It's clearly not to scale, but we don't have images from that time, so we're going to use this as our model, okay? And we're going to come back to this a little bit later on in the message, but essentially, we have a story like this, and it starts with, obviously, there's this adorable baby Jesus who's lying in a manger filled with hay to keep him warm. We usually know that happened in a barn or a stable made out of some sort of wood, some sort of wood structure. We know that there were shepherds nearby, like friendly shepherds who brought some sheep, very hygienic, to come to the birth site. We also know that there were 3 wise men that came along, and they came along and they traveled from the east. They followed this star that hovered over the place where Jesus was born, which was just outside the town of Bethlehem. Now, these are the broad strokes. These are some of the details. But what I want to do is I want to delve a little bit deeper tonight. I want to go a little bit further into the weeds of the story. And I want us to look specifically at what the Bible says, and specifically at a book written by a guy named Luke. Now, Luke was a guy who lived in the first century. He wasn't one of the 12 disciples. And as far as we know, Luke didn't actually know Jesus during his lifetime, but Luke set out to do a thorough investigation into the life of Jesus. So he interviewed Jesus' friends, his childhood buddies, his schoolmates. He talked to people who knew Jesus from the beginning of his life until the end of his life. And then he wrote a report. So, if you're watching this today, or if you're watching online, and you're sort of checking church out, you're not 100% sure about the church thing, but you're kind of investigating Jesus, then Luke is your guy. You're going to love Luke because he's like you. He was just investigating the things of Jesus. Now, Luke wrote one of the 4 accounts of Jesus' life that we find in the Bible. We call those Gospels. The others were written by Matthew, Mark, and John. And right from the outset of his report, after he'd done all these interviews, he wrote up this report. Right from the very outset, Luke says something that is so historically significant that it should stop all of us in our tracks and make us rethink the whole idea of Christmas. And he says it in just one word. He just starts with one word that should stop all of us in our tracks and make us reconsider what it is we believe about the Christmas story. And he simply starts with this word. He starts with the word many. Why is that significant? How many is many? Is many 3? Is many 5? Is many 12? How many is many? We don't really know, but he uses this word many. And the reason why this is so historically significant is that in the first century, there weren't very many people who had the story of their lives written down. And the reason for that is writing was expensive. Writing utensils were expensive. And so really, when we look back through history, we look back through archaeology, really the only stories we have written down for us to read now in this modern day and age are people who were famous or rich and who could afford to hire somebody to write down the details of their life and then hand it over to them so that they could edit it to make themselves look good, right? So rich people would hire somebody to do this, and then they would edit that story in order for them to come out looking really, really good. So the fact that we have just one account of Jesus' life is pretty remarkable because in so many instances, Jesus was a nobody. He was just a day laborer from Galilee who didn't have any money, certainly couldn't afford to pay somebody to write down the details of his life. But Luke, right from the very beginning of his account, he says this. He says, many people set out to write accounts of this life of this guy named Jesus. So why would so many people spend time and money and energy and resources writing the story of this guy who had already been and gone, who during his lifetime maybe traveled 50, 60 kilometers from his house at the most, who was only really in the public eye for 3 or 4 years? Why would somebody take the time and effort, or so many somebodies take the time and effort to write down the story of Jesus? Well, there can only be one answer, and that answer has to be that in the first century, in the land of Judea, something significant happened. Something amazing happened in the life of this guy, Jesus, that was good news. And so people wanted it to be true. They wanted to tell that story over and over again. So it's pretty amazing that we have these stories. And so I wanted to set the scene with that. Before I get into too many of the details, I wanted to set the scene that we have this remarkable library of books that tell us about the amazing life of this guy named Jesus. Many people set out to write an account of his life. So I want to get into a little bit of the details. I want to transition a little bit, go into some of the details of the Christmas story. And one of the first things we notice when we think of the Christmas story is this idea of what they call a manger, right? Now, Luke talks about this right from the outset of his story about Jesus. He talks about how Mary gave birth to Jesus, and then she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger. Now, when you guys think of manger, probably the thing that you picture is something that looks like this, right? A wooden structure filled with hay. And of course, it wouldn't be a manger if there wasn't 8-pound, 6-ounce newborn baby Jesus. Barely can say a word, but still omnipotent, lying snugly in the cloths surrounded by this warm hay. That's what we think of when we think of a manger. But here's the interesting thing. Archaeologists over the centuries have never dug up a wooden structure like this. In fact, what they've shown is that a manger was actually made out of stone. And it was designed specifically to hold water. In fact, here's a photo of a stone manger that I took while I was leading a trip in Israel a few years ago. And it's designed specifically to hold water for the sheep, not for hay. Because in Israel in the first century, even Israel today, you take the sheep out to the food, you don't bring the food to the sheep. So this manger was actually a watering trough. And that changes the story just a little bit, doesn't it? Because it means that Mary, after giving birth to Jesus, probably rolled over and picked up a stone bowl and tipped out some stagnant water and then placed her new baby into that cold, damp stone watering trough. Now, Luke goes on to say that the reason Mary had to place Jesus into a watering trough was because there was no lodging available for them. Now, maybe you've heard in some translations it says there was no room at the inn. And so historically, we've decided that the innkeeper is the villain of the nativity story. But that's a whole other conversation, because when we think inn, we think hotel. I can tell you that, there was no hotels in Bethlehem in the first century. Bethlehem wasn't really a tourist destination. The word inn that we translate as inn actually refers to a pantry that in first century Israel they would place on top of their building so the animals couldn't get to it. So basically they were saying there was no room even in the pantry for Mary to give birth to Jesus. But when we think of this lodging, when we think of where Jesus was born, we usually think of a stable or a barn because that's where you keep sheep. So we picture something that looks a little bit like this. Or if we want to make it just a little bit more authentic, we might make it look like this. But in reality, again, archaeologists who do lots of digs in the Middle East, they have never, ever uncovered a structure that looked like this, especially the wooden side of it, because Bethlehem back then, and Bethlehem still to today, is a town that sits on the edge of a desert. And so when you live on the edge of a desert, there's not many trees to cut down to make buildings, and if you do, you're not going to make them for sheep. So it's more likely that Jesus was born somewhere else. And if you go to Bethlehem today, what you'll find is caves that look a lot like this one. In fact, this is a cave that I found in an open field in Bethlehem. And as I found this cave, I remember we were driving along in the bus, and I yelled out to the bus driver to stop the bus. And he was used to me doing this now because I always do it, and I jump off the bus and run off into the street and then come back. I went up to this cave, and some of the locals came around because they saw the bus pull up, and I was asking them questions about this cave, and they said this is the sort of cave that shepherds have used for thousands of years to keep their sheep. So what the shepherd would do is they would take their sheep into a cave like this, and then they would stack those rocks in front of the entrance so that the sheep couldn't get out. And what's really interesting about this is that the Hebrew word for cave is mikola. That's the Hebrew word for cave. But this word also means a sheepfold, somewhere where you would house sheep. So it's more than likely that Jesus was born in a cave that looked a lot like this one. Now, when I found this cave, when I walked up to it, the top of the entrance probably came up to my chest. So I had to bend over just to walk in. And then once I was inside, I could barely stand all the way up straight, right? I had to always crouch just a little bit because the roof was so low. First thing I noticed when I walked in was the ground was soft and brown. And I learned that it was actually centuries of animal manure that I was walking on that had been squashed into form this ground. And when I kind of tried to turn my head upwards, what I noticed when I looked at the ceiling, it was all black. And it was black from the soot of hundreds of thousands of fires that shepherds have lit inside that cave to keep themselves and their sheep warm. And as I turned around and looked at the walls, what I saw were every place on the walls was covered in bird droppings because there were hundreds of bird nests that had been built into the crevices of this cave. See, while we understand that the birth of Jesus was not clean, it was not sanitary by modern day standards, when we try to make it look warm and we try to make it look inviting and we try to make it look palatable by turning it into this warm barn with nice glowing hay, when we do that, we strip away the power of the Christmas story. You see, the power of the Christmas story comes from knowing that people who follow Jesus believe in a God who willingly stepped into our dirt and our mess to bring us hope and purpose. We believe in a God who stepped into the mess and the chaos and the rawness of life so that we could have hope and we could have a purpose. We miss the impact of this story that is good news of great joy for all people when we start to clean it up too much. Now let's have a look at the shepherds for a minute, okay? Because we know there were shepherds in the story as well. And Luke informs us of this fact. He says there were shepherds in the field, living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. And if you keep reading the story, you find out that an angel goes to the shepherds and announces to them that the Messiah has been born. This guy, Jesus, had been born. And so the shepherds, Luke tells us, hurried off and found Mary and Joseph and the baby who was lying in the manger. Now, typically when we think of this part of the story, what we picture in our minds, because artwork, television, movies, nativity scenes over the centuries have taught us, is that the shepherds were probably 40-year-old men with beards. That the shepherds probably looked a lot like me. They looked nothing like me. Because in first century Israel, culturally, the work of looking after sheep, the work of a shepherd, was typically done by the youngest girl in a family, the youngest daughter in a family. If the family had no girls, then the youngest son would get that job. Some of you who know the life of David, the great poet in the Bible, would know that he was a shepherd. Well, that's because he had no sisters and he was the youngest son. So the work of a shepherd is typically done by a young girl, maybe grade 5, grade 6, grade 7. In fact, every time that I've gone over to Israel and seen shepherds, they are always young girls. One time when I went, I had the opportunity to go to a field on the outskirts of Jericho, and I was following this flock of sheep because I was trying to get photos and videos of this flock of sheep. And I heard this voice yelling behind me, and it sounded like a young kid. And I turned around, and I was met face to face with this young girl. And there was a couple of us who were there, and we started talking to her, and I started asking her questions about specifically why she was out early in the morning. I mean, this was like 5 a.m., chasing after the sheep, and she told us in broken English that they were her sheep, and it was her job in the family as the youngest daughter to look after the sheep. Now, why is that significant? Why do you need to know that the shepherds of Israel in the first century time of Jesus were probably grade 6, grade 7-year-old girls? Why is that even important? Well, Jesus lived in a society that was very patriarchal. Women were second-class citizens. And if you had some great news to share with people, you wouldn't have a woman go and do it. You would declare it to a man. You would declare it to a priest. You would declare it to a magistrate. But this is the thing that I love so much about this story of Jesus, is throughout the story of Jesus, he always elevated the value of women. He always elevated the position of women. And even though I think in the church we've got this a little bit wrong over the centuries and we've set up this patriarchal model where it's men who are in charge, Jesus' teachings say the opposite, that women should have equal status with men. There is not a woman in this room, whether you believe in Jesus or not, who shouldn't be excited about following Jesus, because he valued women and he esteemed women way higher than anybody else in his society ever did. And personally, as a dad to 3 daughters, I like to remind my girls every Christmas that when God announced the birth of his son to save the world, he announced it first to women. And more than that, when God announced the resurrection of his son to save the world, he announced it first to a woman. That's pretty cool. Now I have to transition hard here because now I'm going to start talking about men. Specifically, the wise men. Now we know from the story that there were wise men who came to visit Jesus, right? There were 3 wise men, and here's another artist's impression of them. And you know, usually what we think about is these 3 wise men, and there's 3 of them, and just to tell you a little bit more information about these wise men, they were actually called magi, which is a Greek word which means priests. And the magi were part of a theology school of priests who were also astronomers, which explains why they followed a star to the place where Jesus was born, right? But it's interesting to me that when we hear about the story of the Magi, which is told in a book written by Matthew, who was one of the 12 disciples, he tells us about these Magi, these wise men, and how they came to see Jesus. But the interesting thing is, he doesn't say that there were 3 of them, just that there were 3 gifts. Wait, Dan, sorry. Dude. Not gifts, gifts. He says there were 3 gifts. Sorry about that. He only says there were 3 gifts, right? Magi, actually, culturally, historically, archaeologically, they actually traveled in large groups of 20 to 50 men. Why? Because they were carrying gold and frankincense and myrrh and these valuable items, and they didn't want to be robbed, so they would always arrive in a large gang. But we've always said there were 3 wise men because there were 3 gifts. But the idea of it, Matthew using the word men, implies there was 2 at least, but we think there was probably up to 20 of them. Here's what Matthew writes about the Magi, and specifically we learn some interesting things in what he says about them. He says this, he writes, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. Now in this one verse, we find out so many details about the Christmas story that we've actually gotten wrong. You see, the wise men weren't at the birth of Jesus, but Matthew tells us they arrived after Jesus was born. After Jesus was born. How long after? Well, we're not 100% sure, but we do know that they made a stop off in Jerusalem on the way. Right? They went to Jerusalem first. And then Matthew goes on to write this about the Magi and about the star that they followed specifically. What he says this, he says, and the star they had seen, they being the Magi, had seen in the east, guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and it stopped over the place where the child was. Now notice Matthew here doesn't use the word baby. He doesn't use the word for infant. He uses the word child. He uses the word child. And theologians believe that the Magi probably showed up at probably about 2 years after the time of Jesus, after Jesus' birth. So he was a child by the time they got there. So that means the star probably wasn't over the birth of Jesus. Okay, I fire-hosed you with a bit of information there, and I know you probably all hate me because I'm deconstructing Christmas so much for you, but let's do a quick recap. Okay, can we just do a quick recap of where we were? Okay, so if we go back and have a look at our original nativity scene, what we first will see now is we know that Jesus wasn't placed in a wooden hay basket, but was actually placed in a watering trough filled with stagnant water potentially. We also know that he wasn't born in a barn or a structure made out of wood, but was most likely born in a moldy, damp cave. We also know that the shepherds that were there probably weren't 50-year-old men with beards, but were more likely, late primary school, early high school girls. We also know that there were wise men that came, but there probably wasn't 3 of them. It was probably more likely 20 to 50 of them that came along. And we also know that the star over the birth of Jesus was actually there probably when he was a toddler rather than a baby. So we've covered a whole lot there, except for one more thing, which is the town of Bethlehem. Now, I know by this point, most of you are going, Dave, come on, don't wreck Bethlehem as well.
You've wrecked everything else. I'm never going to be able to look at a Christmas pageant or a nativity scene again without thinking of this message. Please don't wreck Bethlehem for me. Well, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. But let me tell you something super interesting. Bethlehem gets a round of applause. Let me tell you something really interesting about this town of Bethlehem. See, in Hebrew, the word Bethlehem is actually made up of two words. The first word is bet, which means house, and the second word is lechem, which means bread. So Jesus was born in the house of bread. All right, Dave, that's cool, but who cares? What does that mean? That Jesus was born in a bakery? What does that even mean? Why? What does that mean? Why is that significant? Well, I think it's significant because later on as an adult, Jesus would go on to tell his followers, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Now, I think this is interesting. And it's also interesting that later on, Jesus would also say that he is the source of living water from God. And that means that the source of living water was placed in a watering trough after his birth, and that the bread of life was born in the house of bread. That is very Jewish symbolism that provides so much detail and richness to the story of Jesus, well beyond just the broad strokes. So what's the point of knowing all this stuff? How is this going to help? How is this going to help you in your faith journey? How is this going to help you tomorrow at work? How is this going to help you get over the World Cup loss? Well, I think we need to know this because it provides detail to our faith. It provides a richness to our faith. I think we need to know that Jesus was probably born in a cold, damp, moldy cave that was covered in sheep manure and bird droppings. I think it's important for us to know that his mum probably emptied out stagnant water from a watering trough to place him in. I think it's important for us to know these things because these details are a reminder of the extraordinary lengths that Jesus went through so that he could make the first step towards us, towards connecting with you, and towards connecting with me. It's a reminder that Jesus willingly and literally stepped into the mess and filth of our situation so that he could bring hope and life for us. Knowing that Jesus was prepared to be born into chaos, confusion, dirt, manure, then reminds me that he's prepared to engage with my mess now. The fact that Jesus was prepared to be born into manure then tells me that he will deal with the crap of my life every single day. So when I'm facing a chaotic moment in my life, I remind myself that Jesus literally was born into chaos so that I could live in peace. It's a reminder to me of why I follow Jesus. Because following Jesus makes my life better and makes me better at life, but it also gives me hope. It gives me purpose. It gives me a direction. Knowing these details is also a reminder for all of us that there are 1,000 times in history when a baby became a king. But there's only one time in history where a king became a baby. And Jesus did that to bring you hope. Jesus did that to bring me hope. The story behind the first Christmas story is pretty unbelievable. It really is. There are so many important details that we miss. But what makes the story so unbelievable is what makes it believable. The story, it becomes believable because of how unbelievable it is. Because really, no one could make this up. No one could make up that 2,000 years ago, a builder would be born in a rural town in the Middle East and go on to change the world, to save the world, to be worshipped all over the world. You can't make that up, that somebody who was born in a cave in manure would go on to be worshipped around the world, who would change the world and who would change my life. And maybe he's changed your life as well. I mean, if this story was just a myth, if it was just a bedtime story, it probably would have started with once upon a time, or maybe in a galaxy far, far away. But it doesn't. This story starts with a baby being born into filth, with a baby being born into chaos and manure, and it ends with a baby growing up to be a man who sacrificed his life to save us. Why are these details important? Well, I think they're important. I think they're significant because it helps us to understand that this story, the story of Jesus, starts with new life beginning in a cave, and it ends with new life coming out of a cave. This story starts with new life beginning in a cold, wet cave, and it ends with new life coming out of a cold cave. Not new life just for Jesus, but new life for us as well. As my friend Andy Stanley says, the Nativity was 99% chaos and 1% hope. But without the chaos, we would miss the hope. When we try to sanitize the Christmas story, when we try to clean it up and make it palatable for all of us, we start to strip it away from that hope because we start to strip away the chaos. And this is more than just an interesting story. It's a story that was good news that sparked great joy for all people. So again, going back to our original question, is this story good? Is the story of Christmas good? Is it good for humanity? Is it good for Australia? Is it good for the people of the Sunshine Coast? Is it good for you? Is it good for me? Well, Luke thought so. Matthew thought so. The other 12 disciples, they thought so. And millions of people have thought so throughout history. Because the original version of this story was good news. It was compelling news. And when we present it in its rawest, most unsanitized, most unhallmarked version, then I am convinced that people will want the message of Jesus to be true before they're convinced that it's true. But here's the deal. If you don't buy it, if you don't buy this story, I kind of get that. But maybe, just maybe, the version of it that you were told was the wrong version. Maybe somebody used this story to cause chaos in your life. Maybe somebody misused this story. And if that was the case, I'm so sorry. That shouldn't have happened. Because that original story in its rawest, detailed version is actually really good news that sparked great joy for all people. God, I just want to thank you that you sent your son to willingly step into a mess, to step into filth, to step into chaos. And you did that, God, for a reason. As a reminder to all of us that if Jesus can deal with that mess, then he can deal with our mess as well. God, I thank you for that truth. God, I pray that throughout this Christmas period, as we come into contact with Jesus, as we come into close proximity to the story of Jesus, would you remind us of the hope that comes from the rawness of this story? Would you remind us of the purpose that comes from this? And as you do that, God, I pray that we would all find new life in that story, that we would all find new hope in that story. That as we celebrate Christmas together as a church, as we celebrate as a community, that you would constantly remind us of the power and the impact of this incredible, unbelievable, but remarkable story. And we pray this in the amazing, powerful, holy, name of Jesus. And everybody agreed and said, amen. Amen.